The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the sprawling expanse of Oak Ridge Park. Laughter and chatter filled the air as children ran along the playground. Parents gathered on benches, and joggers looped around the winding trails. Underneath an old oak tree, Malik Grant sat with his legs crossed, a battered paperback resting in his lap. He had discovered this spot months ago, tucked away enough to escape the busier parts of the park, but close enough to the parking lot to hear his mom's SUV when it pulled in. His mother, Mayor Evelyn Harper, had texted him earlier, apologizing for running late due to yet another city council meeting. Malik didn't mind. He had a good book and the scent of freshly cut grass to keep him company. With a deep breath, he leaned back against a tree trunk, letting the words of his novel pull him into another world. The sounds of the park faded, replaced by the story's rhythm. It was one of the few times in his day when he felt at peace, free from the pressures of school, basketball practice, and the sometimes heavy weight of being the mayor's son. But his peace was shattered by an unsettling feeling, a prickling sensation that crawled up the back of his neck. He lowered the book, scanning the park. Families played, joggers passed by, and everything seemed normal. Yet, as his eyes landed on a nearby bench, he noticed a woman staring at him. Her pale features were pinched with disapproval, her mouth a tight line. Malik shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, glancing around to see if perhaps she was looking at someone else. But no, her eyes stayed locked on him. Alice Monroe had lived in Oak Ridge for nearly 15 years, raising her two children in the same neighborhood where she had grown up. She prided herself on knowing her community, on recognizing every face in her quiet, suburban bubble. So when she noticed the teenager under the oak tree, a face she didn't recognize, her mind began to race. Why was he sitting there, alone, watching people? Her gaze lingered on the book in his lap, but she dismissed it. Anyone could fake looking harmless. Memories of recent crime reports surfaced in her mind. Stories about vandalism and theft that had crept into their otherwise idyllic suburb. Alice felt her grip tighten on her purse as her heart began to pound. Am I overreacting? She whispered to herself. But the thought of doing nothing felt irresponsible. What if he was up to something? She rose from the bench, her movements stiff and deliberate. Her eyes remained fixed on Malik as she marched toward him. Malik looked up as Alice's shadow fell over him. Her expression was hard, her posture rigid. He blinked, unsure of what to expect. Can I help you, ma'am? He asked, his tone polite but wary. What are you doing here? Alice demanded, her voice sharp. This is a family park. Malik's brow furrowed. I'm just reading, he said, holding up his book as if to prove it. I'm waiting for my mom. Alice's eyes narrowed. For how long? You've been sitting here for hours. Malik shook his head. I haven't been here that long. Maybe half an hour. My mom's running late. That's so. Alice's voice carried a note of skepticism. Her hand drifted to her purse, pulling out her phone. Well, I don't know you, and I don't like the way you're hanging around. I think it's best if you leave. The accusation hit Malik like a slap. Leave? Why? I'm not doing anything wrong. Alice's lips thinned further. This is a family park, she repeated, as though that explained everything. Malik took a slow breath, trying to stay calm. Ma'am, I'm just sitting here. I'm not causing any trouble. My mom will be here any minute. But Alice wasn't listening. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone and began dialing. I'm calling the police. They can sort this out. Malik's stomach dropped. His heart began to race as Alice spoke into her phone. Yes, this is Alice Monroe, she said, her voice loud enough for passersby to hear. I'm at Oak Ridge Park, and there's a young man here acting suspiciously. He's loitering under the big oak tree. Yes, I think he might be a threat. Malik stood, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. Please, ma'am, there's no need for this, he said, his voice steady despite the fear creeping into it. I told you, I'm waiting for my mom. Alice ignored him, her eyes fixed on a point far beyond him as she continued giving the dispatcher details. Around them, a few people paused, their gazes flicking between Alice and Malik. Malik clenched his fists at his sides, feeling a swell of frustration and helplessness. He could already see where this was headed. The faint sound of sirens in the distance sealed it. The sound of sirens grew louder, cutting through the peaceful hum of the park. Malik stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest as Alice kept her phone pressed to her ear, her voice calm but firm. Around them, onlookers began to stop and watch, their murmurs spreading like ripples in a pond. "Please, ma'am," Malik said again, his voice trembling slightly. "You don't need to do this. I'm not a threat. I'm just waiting for my mom." Alice finally hung up, slipping her phone back into her purse. She looked at him with a mixture of caution and indignation. Her lips pursed. "If you're not doing anything wrong, you've got nothing to worry about," she said. Malik swallowed hard. He had heard those words before. On the news, in classrooms, whispered among his friends. They always came before something bad happened. A moment later, the flashing lights appeared, and two police cruisers rolled to a stop at the park's entrance. The sirens cut off abruptly, leaving an eerie silence in their wake. Malik could feel every eye in the park on him as the officers stepped out of their vehicles. Officer Tyler Green adjusted his belt as he approached, his tall frame and calm demeanor giving off an air of professionalism. Beside him, Officer Lucas Sharp moved with a briskness that felt more like agitation. His hand hovered near his holster as his sharp eyes locked onto Malik. "What seems to be the problem here?" Green asked, addressing Alice. His voice was measured. "Almost neutral." Alice stepped forward, her voice firm and authoritative. "I called because this young man has been loitering here for hours. He's been acting suspiciously, and I don't think he belongs here." Malik opened his mouth to protest, but Officer Sharp cut him off with a raised hand. "Let her finish," Sharp said, his tone curt. Alice continued, "I'm just trying to keep the park safe. Families use this space. And, well, you can never be too careful." Malik felt a flush of anger rise in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He'd learned to control his reactions, even when the unfairness of situations like this boiled his blood. "All right, son," Green said, turning to Malik, his tone softer but still wary. "What's your side of the story?" Malik took a deep breath. "I'm just sitting here, waiting for my mom. She's running late from work. I wasn't bothering anyone. I've been here maybe half an hour." Sharp's eyes narrowed. "Got any ID?" "No, sir," Malik said. "I'm only 15. I don't carry ID." The officers exchanged a glance, and Malik felt the weight of their skepticism. "So, you're just sitting here, huh?" Sharp said, his voice dripping with disbelief. "You didn't approach anyone? Didn't cause any disturbances?" "No, sir," Malik replied, his hands still visible at his sides. He noticed that Sharp's hand hadn't moved from his holster, and his stomach tightened with fear. Around them, a small crowd was forming. Phones were out, their cameras pointed at the unfolding scene. Malik caught snippets of murmured conversations. "Why are they questioning him? He looks like a kid. What's going on? This doesn't seem right." Green glanced at the crowd and seemed to realize the optics of the situation. He turned back to Alice. "Ma'am, did you see him do anything specific? Or are you reporting him just because he was here?" Alice hesitated for the first time. "I mean, no, but he was sitting there for a long time, and he looked out of place." "Out of place," Malik muttered under his breath. He couldn't help it. The frustration spilled over. "You mean because I'm black?" Sharp's eyes snapped to Malik. "Watch your tone, son," before the situation could escalate further. The sound of an engine cut through the tension. A sleek black SUV pulled up to the curb, and the doors opened. Out stepped Evelyn Harper, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. Her tailored suit and no-nonsense demeanor immediately drew the crowd's attention. Malik's heart lifted at the sight of his mother. Her presence always made him feel safe, even in situations like this. Evelyn took one look at the scene, her son standing with his hands out, two officers facing him, and Alice standing nearby with a self-satisfied look, and her expression hardened. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd like a knife. Green straightened, recognizing her immediately. Mayor Harper. We. Evelyn raised a hand to cut him off. I asked a question. Why are my officers questioning my son in a public park? Sharp's face reddened. Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious individual. A suspicious individual? Evelyn's voice was calm, but there was a sharp edge to it. And what? Exactly. Made my son suspicious. Alice, who had been standing silent since Evelyn arrived, stammered. You thought. I was just trying to. You thought what? Evelyn turned to her, her eyes blazing. That a black teenager sitting under a tree must be up to no good? The crowd murmured again, their disapproval growing. Alice looked around, her face pale, as she realized the tide had turned against her. Evelyn stepped closer to the officers, her voice low but firm. This is my son. He's 15 years old, and he was waiting for me to pick him up. Do you know how often black boys are criminalized for simply existing in public spaces? Green looked genuinely uncomfortable. Sharp, however, bristled. Ma'am, we were just responding to a call. It's our job. Your job, Evelyn interrupted, her voice rising slightly, is to serve and protect. That includes my son. That includes every child in this community. What you're doing right now is perpetuating a dangerous bias, and it needs to stop. The officers shifted uncomfortably under her glare. The crowd, emboldened by her words, began to chime in. She's right. This is unacceptable. Leave the kid alone. Alice's voice broke through the din, trembling. I didn't mean any harm. I was just trying to keep the park safe. Evelyn's eyes snapped to her. Safe from what? A boy sitting under a tree with a book? You should take a long, hard look at why you felt the need to make that call. The officers, visibly chastened, stepped back. Green muttered an apology, while Sharp reluctantly nodded his agreement. Evelyn placed a protective hand on Malik's shoulder. Are you all right, sweetheart? She asked softly. Malik nodded, though his voice shook. I'm fine. Mom, I'm just tired. Evelyn's expression softened, but when she turned back to the officers and Alice, her resolve returned. This isn't just about my son. This is about every child who has been made to feel like they don't belong. It stops now. The crowd erupted into applause, and as Evelyn guided Malik back to the SUV, the weight of the moment began to sink in. This was more than a confrontation. It was a call to action. As Evelyn and Malik walked toward the SUV, Malik felt the tension leaving his body, replaced by a mix of relief and exhaustion. He glanced back at the park, where the crowd was slowly dispersing, conversations buzzing among them as people took in the weight of what they had just witnessed. Many of them had recorded the encounter on their phones, ensuring that the story would not be limited to those present. Inside the SUV, Evelyn put a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You handled yourself so well. Malik, she said softly, pride in her eyes. You didn't let their words shake you. Malik managed a small smile, but his voice was weary. Thanks, Mom. I just didn't expect something like that to happen. Not here. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Evelyn's jaw tightened. I know, sweetheart. That's the problem. It shouldn't matter where you are or what you're doing. You have every right to exist without people assuming the worst. She took a deep breath, her expression shifting from comforting mother to determined mayor. This isn't over. Malik, we're going to make sure this leads to something meaningful. Malik looked out the window as the SUV pulled away from the park. The familiar streets passed by in a blur. But today, they felt different. He felt different. He had never thought he would be in a situation like this, where he would be confronted just for being himself. It left a bitter taste in his mouth, but he felt a spark of hope too. His mother was determined to turn this encounter into a catalyst for change, and that gave him a sense of purpose. The next morning, the story was everywhere. Clips of the confrontation circulated on social media, reaching thousands of people within hours. Comments flooded in, some in support of Malik and his mother's actions, while others argued against what they called an overreaction. Yet, the video clearly showed the bias in the exchange, and it sparked heated discussions both online and in real life. At City Hall, Evelyn Harper sat with her team, drafting a press release. She knew this incident couldn't be swept under the rug. It had ignited something much larger than a simple misunderstanding. The press release was direct and firm. Yesterday, a troubling incident in Oak Ridge Park highlighted the urgent need for our city to address the issue of implicit bias. No young person, no person, period, should feel criminalized simply for existing in a public space. This event is a reminder that we must confront the biases that shape our perceptions and actions. To that end, I am introducing a comprehensive anti-bias training program for our police force and all city employees, along with community workshops aimed at fostering empathy and inclusivity. Her words were clear. Change was coming, and she would lead it. Evelyn's announcement was met with mixed reactions. Some residents voiced their support, sharing personal stories of bias and how it had affected them or their families. Others felt defensive, unwilling to acknowledge the possibility of bias in their community. One local business owner, Carlos Rivera, reached out to Evelyn directly, offering his support. He organized a town hall meeting for that weekend, encouraging community members to come together, listen, and speak about their experiences and concerns. Evelyn accepted the invitation, determined to turn this momentum into a constructive conversation. On the evening of the town hall, the community center buzzed with energy. Malik joined his mother on stage, feeling both nervous and empowered. He looked out at the crowd, recognizing classmates, teachers, and even some of the people who had been in the park that day. His debate club friends gave him encouraging smiles from the front row, and he felt a surge of confidence. Carlos opened the town hall with a brief speech, emphasizing the need for understanding and open dialogue. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he said. "It's about acknowledging the reality of bias and finding a way to move forward together." Evelyn took the microphone next, her gaze steady as she looked at the gathered faces. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began. "I know this isn't an easy conversation to have, but what happened in Oak Ridge Park is part of a larger issue, and we need to face it together." She turned to Malik, giving him a small nod. He stepped forward, taking a deep breath as he began to speak. "At first, I didn't want to come here," Malik admitted, his voice steady but quiet. "I didn't want to relive what happened, but I realized that if I don't speak up, nothing will change." He looked out at the crowd, catching the eyes of some of the adults who were listening intently. "That day at the park, I was just sitting there, reading, waiting for my mom, and in minutes, I went from feeling safe to feeling like a criminal. And it was all because someone thought I looked out of place." The room fell silent, his words hanging in the air. "I know that bias isn't always something we're aware of, but when you call the police on someone who isn't doing anything wrong, you're telling them that they don't belong. You're saying that they're a threat just because of how they look." He paused, the rawness of his words resonating with the audience. "I don't want anyone else to feel what I felt that day. That's why I'm here. I believe we can do better, but only if we're willing to look at ourselves and ask why we make certain assumptions." When he finished, a soft murmur ran through the crowd, and someone started clapping. Soon, the entire room was applauding, the sound a mix of support and appreciation. Malik looked over at his mother, who was beaming with pride. After Malik's speech, Evelyn opened the floor to the community, encouraging anyone who wanted to share their thoughts. One by one, people stood up, some sharing their own stories of bias, others expressing support for Malik and his mother's call for change. Near the end of the night, Alice Monroe, the woman who had called the police, stood up. The room fell silent as she slowly walked to the front, her face flushed with embarrassment and regret. She took a shaky breath, looking directly at Malik. I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but I realize now that I was wrong. I let my assumptions get the better of me, and I'm sorry for the pain I caused you." Malik looked at her, feeling a mix of emotions: anger, empathy, confusion. But he nodded, acknowledging her apology. Alice turned to the audience, her voice wavering. "I know I can't take back what I did, but I promise to do better. I think we all have to, or we'll keep making the same mistakes." Her words were met with silence at first, but then Carlos spoke up. "It takes courage to admit when we're wrong," he said. "Thank you for being here, Alice. This is the first step. In the weeks that followed the town hall, Evelyn's plan for anti-bias training and community workshops began to take shape. Police officers attended training sessions aimed at addressing implicit bias, learning strategies to de-escalate situations and to approach interactions with greater understanding. Schools got involved too, holding discussions about inclusion and empathy. Malik became a voice for change, speaking to his classmates about his experience and encouraging them to question their assumptions and be allies in the fight against prejudice. His story inspired many, sparking honest conversations about race, privilege, and the need for unity. Alice Munro, humbled by her mistake, became an advocate for Evelyn's initiatives, volunteering her time to support the workshops and educate others about the dangers of implicit bias. It wasn't easy, and she faced criticism, but she stayed committed, driven by the knowledge that change could start with her. Months later, the city felt different. Oak Ridge Park, once the site of a painful experience for Malik, had become a symbol of change. A mural now adorned one of the park's walls, celebrating the community's diversity with bright colors and images of people from all walks of life. Evelyn, Malik, and members of the community gathered there one afternoon to commemorate the mural's completion. Standing before the mural, Malik felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in a long time. This journey had been challenging, but he knew it had sparked something real, something that would continue long after this day. Evelyn wrapped an arm around her son, her voice soft but proud. "You did this, Malik. You helped make this change." Malik smiled, his heart swelling with pride and hope. "No, Mom, we did this." As they stood together, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and allies, Malik knew that the journey toward a just and inclusive community was far from over. But he also knew that they were moving in the right direction, one conversation, one lesson, one change at a time. In the months following the mural's unveiling, Evelyn Harper's anti-bias initiative became a model for neighboring communities. Her determination to create a more inclusive city resonated far beyond Oak Ridge. Other mayors reached out, eager to implement similar programs in their towns. For Malik, the experience of being thrust into the public eye had been daunting, but it had also revealed his strength. His speech at the town hall had sparked a series of opportunities. Schools invited him to speak. Local organizations asked for his perspective, and his story became a centerpiece in discussions about racial bias. Though the attention was overwhelming at times, Malik knew his voice mattered. One afternoon, Malik returned to Oak Ridge Park alone. The park had changed in small but meaningful ways. New signs celebrated inclusivity and kindness, and families of all backgrounds seemed to gather more openly and freely. He sat under the same oak tree, this time with a different book in hand. As the breeze rustled through the leaves, he thought about how much he had changed since that day. The fear and anger he had felt had given way to a quiet determination to make the world better, not just for himself, but for everyone. He glanced up when he heard a voice. It was Jamal, one of his classmates from the debate club. "Hey, Malik," Jamal called, holding up his phone. "You're trending again." Malik groaned playfully. "What now?" Jamal grinned as he showed Malik a post from a national news outlet. It was a feature on Mayor Harper's anti-bias program, highlighting Malik's role in inspiring change. The headline read, "From Bias to Breakthrough, How a Teen Sparked a City's Transformation." Malik laughed. "Man, I just wanted to sit and read a book." Jamal shrugged, smiling. "Guess you're a hero now." Malik shook his head, but there was a warmth in his chest. "Nah, just doing what needed to be done." Across town, Alice Munro stood in front of a classroom at Oak Ridge Middle School. She had volunteered to lead a session about implicit bias, a program developed in collaboration with Evelyn Harper's office. As she spoke to the students, she shared her own experience, the mistakes she had made, and the lessons she had learned. "I thought I was protecting my community," she said, her voice steady but emotional. "But what I was really doing was letting my fear dictate my actions. I didn't see Malik for who he really was, a teenager, just like any of you. And that's something I'll carry with me forever." The students listened, their faces thoughtful. For Alice, these moments were hard but necessary. She wanted to make amends, not just to Malik, but to everyone she had wronged with her assumptions. After the session, a student approached her. "Thanks for sharing that, Ms. Monroe," the boy said. "I think a lot of people don't even realize they're being biased. It makes me want to pay more attention to how I treat people." Eddie smiled, a genuine warmth in her expression. "That's all we can do. Pay attention and try to be better." A year later, the city had become a beacon of progress. Evelyn's anti-bias program had expanded to include workshops for businesses, schools, and community groups. The police department had undergone significant reforms, including a citizen oversight committee that held officers accountable for their actions. Malik, now 16, had fully embraced his role as a youth advocate. He had spoken at state-level conferences and even appeared in a documentary about community-driven change. But through it all, he remained grounded, focusing on his schoolwork, basketball, and the friends who had supported him from the beginning. Evelyn, too, had grown in her role as mayor. The challenges she faced were immense. But the Oak Ridge Park incident had solidified her reputation as a leader who wouldn't back down from difficult conversations. She often spoke about the power of small moments to create big change, citing her son's experience as a turning point for the city. On the anniversary of the town hall, the community gathered once again at Oak Ridge Park. This time, it was for a celebration, a day dedicated to unity and reflection. Food trucks lined the street, music filled the air, and children played freely in the park. Malik stood on a makeshift stage with Evelyn by his side. Together, they addressed the crowd, their voices filled with hope and gratitude. "This park is where it all began," Evelyn said, her gaze sweeping over the crowd. "It's a place that reminds us of where we were, but also how far we've come. And that's thanks to all of you." Malik stepped forward, gripping the microphone. "A year ago, I sat under that oak tree, just trying to enjoy the day. What happened after that was hard, but it showed me something important. Change is possible, and it starts with each of us." The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers carrying across the park. As Malik and Evelyn stepped off the stage, they were met with hugs, handshakes, and words of encouragement from friends and strangers alike. Late that evening, after the celebration had ended and the park was quiet again, Malik returned to the oak tree one last time. He ran his hand along its rough bark, thinking about everything it represented. This tree had witnessed his worst moment, but it had also been the start of something beautiful. He sat down, the cool night air wrapping around him, and opened his book. As he read, he felt a sense of peace, a deep, unshakable confidence that no matter what challenges lay ahead, he had the strength to face them. The lessons of the past year echoed in his mind. Everyone has a role to play in creating a better world. And sometimes, the smallest actions, a conversation, a moment of reflection, a stand against injustice, could create ripples that changed everything. Malik smiled to himself, his heart full of hope. The journey wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next.